Good morning. This is Ron. It is Friday, April the 13th. Welcome to Story Time. And today is the last segment of Chapter 13, The Stimulus and the Response, from Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? And to kind of recap, the chapter is divided into basically two by Ayn Rand, a section called The Stimulus and a section called The Response. And I've been reading from the response section over the past day or two. And the whole chapter is devoted to basically critiquing a book that was written by Dr. B.F. Skinner called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And so now the final segment of this chapter. If, quote, the possession of knowledge, unquote, is unattainable, what do you acquire when you, quote, explore the world as it is, unquote? And why do you explore it? What is a soft fact? What do you act on when you cannot act on knowledge or facts? The review may be an example of such action. But I shall borrow a phrase from Noam Chomsky's essay and say that these are, quote, questions, quote, which I happily leave to others to decode, unquote. The Daily Times reviewer may be taken as typical of the present, a frightened liberal trying to convince us, and himself, that Mr. Skinner's totalitarian state is the wave of the future. But the Sunday Times reviewer is the future of Mr. Skinner's theories, their successful product and embodiment, who has been molded by the, quote, contingencies of reinforcement, unquote, in our universities, who sees reason, individualism, and autonomy as incontrovertibly non-existent, sees no point in arguing about them, sees nothing beyond the range of the immediate moment, regards Mr. Skinner as old-fashioned, and goes on from there. If you've read this fountainhead, you will understand the relationship. He is the Gus Webb to Mr. Skinner's Ellsworth Toohey. The Times chose the publication of Beyond Freedom and Dignity as an occasion to go beyond B.F. Skinner. A different push in the same direction was provided by Time magazine. The headline on its cover, September 20, 1971, announced, B.F. Skinner says, "We can't afford freedom." Not a very original statement, but regarded, apparently, as important or valuable enough to justify placing Mr. Skinner's picture on the cover and giving him a lengthy story. The story, however, is flattering only in its length. Otherwise, it is non-committal and empty, playing both sides of the fence in the safe modern manner, i.e., praising Mr. Skinner and insulting him by quoting his enemies. If you wonder what motives could bring Mr. Skinner to his theories, what frustration could lead him to so profound a hatred of mankind, and who would be his first victims, the Times story offers three passages that provide eloquent clues. The first is a quotation from Mr. Skinner's novel, Walden 2. The speaker, Time explains, quote, is T.E. Frazier, a character in Walden 2, and the fictional founder of the utopian community described in that novel. He's also an alter ego of the author, unquote. The quotation, quote, I've had only one idea in my life, a true idée fixe, to put it as bluntly as possible, the idea of having my own way. Control expresses it, the control of human behavior. In my early experimental days, it was a frenzied, selfish desire to dominate. I remember the rage I used to feel when a prediction went awry. I could have shouted at the subjects of my experiments, behave, damn you, behave as you ought, unquote. The second passage deals with Mr. Skinner's youth. In his college days, he wrote short stories and, quote, sent 3 of them to Robert Frost, who praised them warmly. That encouragement convinced Fred Skinner that he should become a writer. The decision, he said, was disastrous. In his own words, he failed as a writer because he had nothing important to say. The third passage is about Twin Oaks, a real-life commune founded on a farm in Virginia and, quote, governed by Skinner's laws of social engineering, unquote. Quote, private property is forbidden except for such things as books and clothing. No one is allowed to boast of individual accomplishments. What is considered appropriate behavior, cooperating, showing affection, turning the other cheek, and working diligently, is, on the other hand, applauded or reinforced by the group, unquote. Quote, the favorite sports are cooperation volleyball and skinny dipping in the South Anna River. False modesty is another of one of the sins that are not reinforced, and there's plenty of folk singing and dancing, unquote. In regard to the consequences, quote, after starting with only $35,000, Twin Oaks, 4 years later, still finds survival a struggle. The farm brings more emotional than monetary rewards. Members would find it cheaper to work at other jobs and buy their food at the market. Beyond economics, there are serious psychological problems at Twin Oaks, and few members have stayed very long. Turnover last year was close to 70%. The ones who leave first, in fact, are often the most competent members, who still expect special recognition for their talents. Competent people are hard to get along with, says Richard Statsman, one of Twin Oaks' trained psychologists. Quote, they tend to make demands, not requests. We cannot afford to reinforce ultimatum behavior, although we recognize our need for their competence. When they leave, the community not only loses their skills, but also sacrifices a potential rise in its standard of living, unquote. For my comments on this, see Atlas Shrugged. The cultural establishment has pushed Beyond Freedom and Dignity to their bestseller lists. The most dangerous part of its potential impact, particularly on young readers, is not that the book is convincing or eloquent, but that it is so bad. If it were less crudely irrational and inept, a reader could give the benefit of the doubt to those who were taken in by some of its trickily complex arguments. But if so evil a thesis as the advocacy of totalitarian dictatorship is offered in such illogical, unconvincing terms, yet it is acclaimed as, quote, important, unquote, what is one to think of the intellectual and moral state of our culture? A rational reader may become paralyzed, not by fear, fear is not a psychological danger, but by disgust, contempt, discouragement, and, ultimately, withdrawal from the realm of the intellect, which, perhaps, is Mr. Skinner's hope. But before you draw the malevolent universe conclusion that falsehood always wins over truth, or that men prefer irrationality to reason and dictatorship to freedom, and therefore, what's the use, consider the following. Human Events, January 15, 1972, reports that the National Institutes of Mental Health had granted $283,000 to Dr. B.F. Skinner, which apparently financed the writing of his book. The New Republic, January 28, 1972, gives some details. The Skinner Grant, quote, was one of 20 senior research career awards, that is, plums for scientific leaders in mental health across the board rather than a unique grant. The particular award was made for the purpose of integrating and consolidating Skinner's findings and considering the application of the science of behavior to the problems of society. This is the way an establishment is formed and placed beyond the reach of dissent. What chance would a beginner, a nonconformist, an opponent of behaviorism have against the entrenchment power of a clique supported by government funds? This is not a free marketplace of ideas anymore. Evil, falsehood, irrationality are not winning in free competition with virtue, truth, and reason. Today's culture is ruled by intellectual pressure groups, which have become intellectual monopolies backed, like all monopolies, by the government's gun and the money of the victims. The solution, of course, is not to censor research projects, but to abolish all government subsidies in the field of the social sciences and eventually in all fields. But this is a different subject which I will discuss in the next chapter. The significance of B.F. Skinner's book lies in his eloquent demonstration of the results of philosophical collapse and governmental power. When the intellectual default of the victim permits the dead hand of the government to get a stranglehold on the field of ideas, a nation will necessarily be pushed beyond freedom and dignity. And that is the end of the Stimulus and Response, Chapter 13. I believe the longest chapter in this book about B.F. Skinner's book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And let me see here. I like the fact that she was she got down to the malevolent universe conclusion, and that gave some examples of how that is implemented or represented in day-to-day life. that the idea that falsehood wins over the truth, men prefer irrationality to reason, and dictatorship to freedom, and therefore, what's the use? And you see that by creating a false, malevolent universe premise, that eventually what you hope to do as a socialist is basically just shut people up. You put people in a position where it is either join my movement or shut the hell up and get out of the way. So, and the challenge is to not join the movement, but not shut up and get the hell out of the way either. One of the bones I wanted to pick with her, though, was about the free marketplace of ideas, where she said, let's see, the way an establishment is formed. What chance would a beginner, a nonconformist, an opponent of behaviorism have against the entrenched power of a clique supported by government funds? It's not a free marketplace of ideas anymore. Evil, falsehood, and irrationality are not winning in a free competition with virtue, truth, and reason. Today's culture is ruled by intellectual pressure groups, which have become intellectual monopolies backed, like all monopolies, by the government's gun and the money of the victim. And so what she's doing, though, is again giving a nod to subjectivism in being non-committal. What she should have said here was what instead of a nonconformist or a beginner or an opponent of behaviorism, she should have said, what chance does the truth have against evil, falsehood, and irrationality when the deck is stacked and the government is backing the false and the irrational, and it is up to the small, average individual to try to make truth win out over falsehood, again, in the face of the government's gun and the money of taxpayers. So that's the end of that chapter And so tomorrow, let's see, yes, chapter 14, The Establishing of an Establishment, written in 1972. And perhaps I will have some time tomorrow also for a Storytime Extra. And until tomorrow, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.